Picture two rival beetles shoving each other off a tree branch, each one armed with a weapon on its head longer than its own body. Now picture that same species living a short boat ride away, where males carry a weapon barely a third that size. What happened to them? Nature is full of weapons this exaggerated. Deer grow antlers heavy enough to slow them down. Narwhals carry a single spiral tusk taller than a person. Rhino beetles carry a horn built for flipping rivals over like a tiny bulldozer. None of these weapons are for hunting. They barely help an animal survive at all. They exist for one reason only: winning access to a mate, a pattern a naturalist noticed more than a century and a half ago and gave its own name to: sexual selection. So here's a question worth sitting with. If bigger weapons usually win more fights and more mates, why would evolution ever push in the opposite direction and shrink one instead? Islands have a strange habit of doing exactly that. Biologists call it island syndrome, a set of changes that keep showing up wherever animals get cut off on a small patch of land surrounded by water. Sometimes island syndrome makes animals bigger. Giant tortoises. Komodo dragons big enough to bring down a deer. Sometimes it does the opposite, and animals shrink, lose the ability to fly, or lose their fear of predators entirely, because the predators that shaped that fear were never there to begin with. Now bring that same idea back to a beetle with an oversized jaw. On mainland Japan, males use those jaws exactly the way you would expect, prying rivals off a tree trunk to guard a single prized feeding spot where sweet tree sap oozes out of the bark. These beetles are not some obscure curiosity either. In Japan, they are practically celebrities. Kids collect them, breeders compete over the biggest specimens, and in some neighborhoods you can genuinely buy a live beetle out of a street vending machine. South of the mainland, a chain of small volcanic islands called the Izu Islands stretches out into the Pacific. And on those islands, something odd happens to this exact species the farther out you travel. Island by island heading south, the jaws get a little smaller each time. Not dramatically at first, just a gradual, steady shrinking. Until you reach the farthest island in the chain, where males carry jaws so stubby and reduced that for years some researchers assumed they belong to an entirely different species. Why would one population on one island lose its signature weapon almost completely, while its closer neighbors barely changed at all? Evolutionary biologists have argued about a version of this question for decades, and it usually comes down to two competing explanations. Maybe it is just random luck, the kind of drift you would expect in any small, isolated population. Or maybe something is actively pushing those jaws to shrink on purpose. To understand which one is right, you first need to understand a concept called gene flow, and honestly, it is easier to picture than it sounds. Imagine two neighboring towns connected by a busy bridge. People cross constantly. They move in, they marry in, and over generations, any small genetic quirk that pops up in one town gets diluted by the traffic before it can really take hold. Now imagine that bridge washes out. One town stays connected to the wider world. The other is suddenly cut off completely. Whatever differences show up there next have nothing left to dilute them, and they can build up freely, generation after generation. That is essentially what a chain of islands can do to a population of beetles, except instead of a bridge, the barrier is open ocean, and instead of decades, we are talking about geological time. If you have ever wondered why animals on remote islands so often look like exaggerated or shrunken versions of their mainland relatives, this push and pull between connection and isolation is usually the answer hiding underneath. Here is a detail that makes this particular beetle story even stranger. Some of the closer islands in the chain are still swapping genes with the mainland population right now, today through the same kind of ongoing traffic as that bridge between towns. But the farthest island shows no sign of that traffic at all. Genetically, it looks like a town that lost its bridge a very long time ago and never got it back. So what actually cut that one island off when its closer neighbors stayed connected? The likely culprit is a powerful ocean current that runs straight through the middle of this island chain. A river of warm water inside the ocean itself, strong enough to sweep drifting animals off course before they ever reach that final island. If this kind of real detective story, chasing a strange pattern in nature back to its actual cause, is the sort of thing you find genuinely interesting, hit subscribe, because we dig up a new one every week. Now, back to that isolated island, because the beetles living there were about to get a lot stranger. Isolation alone does not prove that something was actively selecting for smaller jaws. It could still just be random chance, a population drifting genetically because it is small, not because smaller jaws were ever an advantage. To rule that out, you need to check whether the isolated population lost genetic diversity across its entire genome evenly, the signature of pure chance, or whether one very specific stretch of DNA stands out from the rest, the signature of something being actively favored. Getting the genetic material to even ask that question was not exactly glamorous work. Researchers spent years combing forest floors and tree trunks across nearly a dozen locations, from the Japanese mainland all the way out to the most remote island in the chain, collecting beetles by hand, one population at a time. So what did digging through all that DNA actually turn up? When that genetic material finally got sequenced, whole genome and all, and the isolated island population was compared against every other population, one gene stood out immediately from the rest of the genome. It is called INR2, and it belongs to a family of genes that controls how insulin-like growth signals shape different parts of an animal's body while it is still developing before it ever leaves the larval stage. On the isolated island, this gene carries two changes found nowhere else in any other population sampled. And the DNA sitting right around that gene shows dramatically less variation than the rest of the genome. Exactly the fingerprint you would expect if natural selection had swept through and locked one version of it in. That was a strong clue, not proof, since a gene can sit right next to something important without actually doing anything itself. So the team ran a direct experiment. They took beetle larvae from the mainland population, the ones that should grow full-size jaws, and silenced that one gene using a lab technique that blocks a specific gene from being read. What happened next is the kind of result that turns a strong clue into an actual answer. Males that grew up with that gene switched off developed noticeably smaller jaws, closely matching the natural stubby shape found on the isolated island. The exact shape evolution had already arrived at on its own. One gene, switched off in a lab, recreated what isolation alone had already done in the wild, over roughly 150,000 years. So why would evolution ever favor smaller jaws in the first place, once the isolation gave it the freedom to? The likely answer comes down to food. Mainland beetles fight over a resource worth defending: hard sap seeping from a handful of oak trunks, a concentrated prize that rewards whoever holds the biggest weapon. The isolated island never developed oak forests at all. Instead, these beetles feed on fallen mulberry fruit scattered loosely across the forest floor, a resource too spread out for any single male to guard, no matter how large his jaws are. Take away the prize worth fighting over, and an oversized weapon stops paying for itself. It just becomes extra weight to carry around. Here's the one honest caveat worth keeping in mind. The lab experiment proves this gene really does shrink mandibles. That part is now solid, tested evidence. The specific link to mulberry fruit and missing oak forests is still the best explanation on the table, not something tested directly, and the researchers themselves are upfront about that distinction. It is not just the jaws that changed either. On the mainland, males used their oversized jaws to lift a rival straight up and off a tree trunk in one motion. On the isolated island, these beetles now live mostly on the ground, squeezing into tight spaces under fallen logs to guard the spots where females lay their eggs. Males there fight completely differently, pushing an opponent sideways instead of ever trying to lift them. Even the genetics back that up. Among the small handful of genes that changed specifically on the isolated island, several were tied not just to body shape, but to mating and territorial behavior itself, suggesting the shrunken jaw and the new fighting style evolved together as one connected package. Zoom back out for a second, because the full picture here is oddly beautiful. Two forces, constant mixing on one side, complete isolation on the other, sitting right next to each other in the same small island chain, produced two genuinely different evolutionary outcomes within the same species. On the island still connected to the mainland, gene flow keeps diluting any local drift towards smaller jaws, almost like the mainland genome keeps getting reintroduced faster than local change can take hold. On the one island cut off completely, natural selection had roughly 150,000 years of uninterrupted quiet to work with, and it used that time to rewrite a single gene until the island's most famous weapon nearly disappeared. It is a genuinely rare thing to catch evolution this directly, not just spotting a pattern across a family tree, but tracing it all the way down to one gene, testing that gene in a live experiment, and watching it reproduce nature's own result on command. And it all started with something as simple as researchers noticing that beetles on one particular island just looked different and refusing to accept chance as the full answer. So next time you hear that isolation shapes evolution, remember it is not some abstract textbook line. On one small Pacific island, it is written directly into the size of a beetle's jaw,